We will hear argument this morning in case 2512.
Grievances we could go into with this system. I think we could be here for hours.
National Collegiate Athletic Association.
I think we have some proof, even a few years into NIL now, that people care about the logo.
There are too many people in power who have no desire to give up that power.
The NCAA's ever-shifting decisions, not stable decisions.
Does the concept of amateurism in college athletics even matter anymore?
They've capped it again without any sort of collective bargaining.
We'll finish with our unilateral decision. Everyone, welcome to another episode of Unilateral Decisions. If you're watching us today, we'll address the elephant in the room. Both Sam and myself are wearing eyewear for the first time. A lot of eye health issues on the team, but luckily most people are probably listening to this, don't have to watch it. So we'll power through with some weak eyesight, and maybe we'll try to get a sponsorship from a local optometrist. But in the meantime, we're talking Mike's favorite subject, one of my favorite subjects, tampering, the thing that every coach complains about, but says they don't do themselves. And now we've got a documented case from the NCAA, University of Iowa, Kirk Ferentz, their football team back in 2022. So let's start from the basics. What exactly are tampering? Joe, tampering when it comes to recruiting, why is it something a coaching staff would be interested in doing?
Well, it all comes down to, obviously, somebody's not in the portal, but, they're finding ways to get in touch with student athletes who, they'd like to recruit to their team, but they're on another team. That's the easy, simple explanation that everybody understands. Why would a coach do it? The penalty is significantly less than the crime. I mean, what was Iowa's self-imposed sanctions? It was like 24 individual recruiting days, vacated wins, which that wasn't self-imposed. They fought that, which I don't know why you would, because it doesn't really matter. And then a $25,000 fine. Well, we can talk about whether or not that fits the crime or not. But
and then Kirk Ferentz, the head coach of Iowa, was he voluntarily suspended himself for one game, the 44-0 win against Northern Iowa, if I remember correctly.
And there was 24 individual recruiting days forfeited, but 14 of them have already happened. Head coach self-imposed previously, so there's 10 individual recruiting days left that they're going to lose, and I don't know that matters either.
With that, I mean, is there a school in the country, Division I football and men's basketball, that's not tampering right now is my question. And then with Iowa kind of self-reporting all of this, what's the benefit to self-reporting when maybe it's just this little slap on the wrist and it takes attention away from something else? I mean, Mike, from your perspective.
Sure. I think back to the first question, I mean, who knows? And what's the definition of tampering, right? And that is part of the equation here where you've got athletes who have been at so many schools who are in college. You've got high school athletes going into college who were courted by so many colleges. And you've got so many assistant coaches bouncing around the country going to different schools. They have legitimate relationships with a lot of these players. And there's nothing to stop them from saying, awesome game. Congrats, proud of you. There really is nothing to stop that. Is it nefarious to some degree? I don't know. They might be in the portal later, right? You're just kind of keeping relationships warm. Maybe there was a feeling a while ago that if an athlete committed somewhere, you could text them without anybody feeling like, oh, you're trying to court them. But at this point, everybody can leave whenever they want to leave. And so there is a little bit of a different sort of behind the scenes calculation maybe about maintaining those relationships. But it doesn't necessarily mean that everything's nefarious. And so what is tampering? What exactly is tampering? Does it have to be deliberate and explicit about asking somebody to come join you at your next school? I mean, certainly I think we can all agree that's below board, but what rises to the level of a violation, depends a little bit on self-reporting. So I guess that's kind of the point. And, forever internally inside departments, it was generally spoken, at least by the compliance staff, that it's a really good thing. It's a good thing to self-report because you got to have some violations so that nobody's coming and knocking on your door asking why you have zero. Mm-hmm. So there's a calculated risk to saying, we turn that one in. Do we look closely at that one? Is there smoke, fire? Do we care? Should we look at that one? There's some thought that goes into it to say, well, that one's not going to hurt us that bad. $25,000 fine. We can fundraise that a couple days. Turn that one in, That's kind of how it's worked. And as the NCAA violation piece becomes less and less a part of college athletics, quite frankly, because courts are overruling some of what these rules are. It has kind of gone out of vogue, the self-reporting stuff, because I think schools feel like, why would I anymore? There's no reason to. There's no reason to risk even the light penalty because it's not going to stand up in court. And I think we'll kind of see where the tampering stuff goes with regard to that too.
I still bringing up some real strong memories. I'm the proud owner of 2 NCAA violations myself, one of which was a recruiting violation because new legislation came out that said you can do any sort of customizable recruiting video. You can record the recruits on their recruiting trip. No rules. Do whatever you want. We don't care. Turns out that was a lie. And what you couldn't do is have them in a uniform with a basketball on the court. And that became an NCAA violation for a student athlete that went on to transfer 3 more times. So very fitting in the NIL space. We didn't have a $25,000 fine from that particular violation, but
so why not report it? You know,
we did.
Like exactly. That's what I'm saying. You report that 100%. One, so you don't report the other ones.
Joe, you mentioned it already, but this Kirk Ferentz thing in Iowa, the punishment, very minor, not a lot of money, not a lot of tangible negative impact. So when you look at this, is there any reason not to? I mean, how do you view that punishment befitting this supposed crime?
Well, the thing I'm okay with is that the way these have been implemented is that they're not impacting future student athletes. Like that's always the hard part when you get NCAA violations in the past and the penalty is in the future. Like you got a bowl ban and it's like, well, now the kids that weren't even a part of this are the ones that are paying the price. So I like that. I'm probably old school and I'd love to see it not happen. Mike has made the point. Like it's just a part of, what things are now. I mean, you've got all these relationships. At some point they're going to be in the portal. The chances are good. I mean, highly likely that that's going to be the case. So you keep the doors open and, is reaching out to somebody's parents 13 times, within the scope of what Walsh is talking about? Probably not. But, I'd like to see it curbed. But outside of impacting, future student athletes at an institution, I don't necessarily have an answer.
I think one point does need to be raised with all this when we're talking about tampering, we're talking about contacting, and yeah, Mike, you're spot on. I mean, there's so many relationships anyway, and nowadays especially, it's so easy to just send a text or send a DM, and it's hard to really kind of judge what is tampering, what is not tampering. But there's also another elephant in the room, which is that now it's very common, and in fact, as of just yesterday, as we're recording this, it's now legal for athletes to have agents. And, for the coach to reach out to the agent and say, hey, is there interest coming here? When is that tampering? When is that not tampering? And, especially when you're talking about, and this is something that I know we're going to probably be talking about later because it's such an important part of this conversation. It's very much kind of alongside of it, especially when you only have athletes on necessarily 1-year contracts. When we're talking about their NIL, we're talking about, their scholarships in a lot of these cases as well. Is reaching out to ask them about their status for next year. Is that actually tampering or not? Is that actually something where, it could be something that I think our feelings about whether, the ethics or morals of the situation, about the competitive balance part of it, the situation can definitely vary. But at the end of the day, how do we define tampering? Is it all going to be extreme cases like we saw with, Clemson, Dabo Swinney coming out and saying, hey, you texted my player while I was sitting in class, first day of school. That's a little bit different, but where exactly is the line here?
Yeah, talking about does the penalty fit the crime? I think I'd turn it on its head a little bit and ask, does the risk outweigh the reward? And generally speaking, no, like the risk doesn't outweigh the reward. It's we've talked earlier about ADs who overspend. And coaches who take the risk of tampering, for the most part, are creating a risk of consequences that somebody else will have to face. And so the risk-reward balance is out of whack to say, why would a coach not take that chance? If they feel like that's going to make a difference, they feel like that's going to get them an extra win, an extra contract year, the next deal, like whatever, the risk reward is definitely out of place. And so I think that has to be, examined a little bit, but it's hard. It's hard to establish that. I do think that, to Joe's point, and to follow up on Joe's point, oftentimes the penalty is actually like faced by someone who really was not involved at all, right? We talk about bowl bans, the scholarship piece, which has changed a little given the House settlement. But if you were to say, hey, the penalty is that you lose a roster spot, like you're down to 104 now, or you're down whatever, then the second and third order effects it's not even the athlete who was going to go to Iowa. It's the athlete who was going to go to Illinois State on a scholarship at the FCS level doesn't have that one because someone isn't at FBS now that there's one less roster spot. And now that kid who was going to be the last scholarship recipient at an FCS school is now looking at a Division II opportunity. And a Division II athlete who is at the bottom of that last roster is now looking at a Division III opportunity or nothing at all. And so the cascading impact is not on the people who had anything to do with the penalty. And so, there were no scholarship revocations here in this case, which, I think is a step in the right direction, because for a long time that was the thing where it's like, that just doesn't hurt who you think it hurts, But yeah, it's a risk reward profile to me, and it doesn't, there's nothing that tells the coaches to stop doing it.
And also that becomes yet another exhibit in these eligibility lawsuits where, the NCAA is trying to defend themselves and saying, we are looking out for the best interest of, incoming high school athletes and trying to protect these spots. And if they're taking away spots from players, I think that's something that clearly bites against them in a lot of these arguments as well. It's something where, I think from, as we've kind of shifted the way we look at college sports and as the rules have shifted as well, we definitely don't want to see kind of the future athletes getting punished. And, it's good that, the NCAA has really shifted on that. It's definitely a positive step, but it also kind of brings up the question of how exactly do we even punish these in the first place? Like what exactly are we doing? And that, that even doesn't even get into the question of, I don't think it's necessarily a coincidence that the first time we've actually seen some kind of violations for tampering, some kind of NCAA action for tampering was on a self-reported violation. This is clearly something going on all the time. And I think coaches, the reason why I think a lot of them are comfortable doing it is because they see all their colleagues doing it, because they know their kids are getting tampered with, their athletes are getting tampered with. And it's just part of the system now. And it's not something where the NCAA clearly does not feel comfortable going after violations, even if they necessarily know about. They feel like they need to do all their due diligence, which is fair and understandable, and honestly the right call, considering that, there's a substantial risk that if they do go after a school for tampering, that, the school makes a call to the Attorney General, and we see something similar to what we saw in Ohio and Tennessee.
Put your head coaching hats on, and Joe, we'll start with you. You're a head coach, one of these major programs. What's something that would actually get you to stop tampering? What is an appropriate punishment that would make you second guess the risk reward?
Well, if I was the head coach, I don't think we'd have to get to penalties. I'd be terrible, and I'd be fired, and that would resolve.
You'd need to find some creative solutions, though.
Yeah, I don't know. I really don't. That's a tough question. I think what this all comes back to is needing to, rebuild this system. It's every year is free agency. We've got 1-year contracts, and that's kind of a question I have for Sam is, could the solution to this problem be multi-year contracts with buyouts?
It could. And I'll say that very kind of delicately, because there's a lot we just don't know about the enforceability of multi-year contracts, both from the standpoint of, is it actually enforceable in court? Because when we have things like buyouts are just what we call liquidated damages clauses, where it's language written into the contract saying if there's a breach of contract, the damages will be X. It doesn't, if you don't have a buyout, that doesn't mean there's no damages. There's still going to be damages. You could still file a lawsuit. It's just a little harder to calculate those damages. But the issue is that liquidated damages clause, and I think I've mentioned this on the show before, liquidated damages clauses have to be reasonable in light of what is actually being lost from the contract. So if you have a buyout for $10 million for a player, the player's value on the field might be worth $10 million, and that might be what the school is losing out by losing out on this player. But at the same time, that's not what the contract is for. Contract is for their NIL services. So we don't have kind of a decision from a court yet. We don't have kind of a clear idea from a court saying like this, we're actually going to interpret this as a pay for play contract. We're actually going to interpret the on-field play consistent with, kind of looking at these damages, even though the contract specifically disclaims the idea that it's pay for play, which is kind of this weird little balance that's kind of necessary because of just where we are in college sports right now. And kind of, to be frank, kind of just trying to disclaim the obvious, which is that these contracts are pay for play. The other side of the coin, of course, is the practical side, which is are we actually going to see schools enforcing these contracts? We've seen it a few times. Damon Williams, obviously at Washington, Darian mentioned Duke, now Brendan Sorsby at, coming from Cincinnati to Texas Tech. We have seen some enforcement of it. We haven't seen any kind of resolution on it on the way that I kind of talked about in terms of a court decision. We've seen a couple settlements, but that kind of leads to the question of I think schools are still a little hesitant to kind of dip their toes in the water there because they're not sure how it's going to impact recruiting. They're not sure if they're going to look like the bad guys in these situations, and maybe there's some stuff behind the scenes that we're seeing and we're not just hearing about, where the schools are willing to pay these buyouts and happens all under the table. But that kind of communication is going to be interesting as well. I mean, we currently have active litigation between two schools, Wisconsin, and Miami over Miami allegedly tampering with a player and getting him to transfer from Wisconsin. So a lot that needs to be kind of worked out here.
So I think that it's also interesting, and I'm curious to get Sam's take on a couple things here. So I don't think anybody at the NCAA who is helping to make these decisions is ignorant nor stupid. And to all the points you just mentioned, so many, it feels to me like they're making the decision deliberately that handling the tampering situation would more or less require actually having the employment conversation. And the lesser of two evils for them right now is to just kind of let tampering be a thing that we're all trying to figure out. And I don't necessarily disagree with them. I personally would like to tackle the employment thing if I were in their shoes, but I get it. I get how that is a much bigger hill to climb than dealing with whether or not Kirk Ferentz did something 4 years ago that's going to impact how Iowa plays in a bowl game this year. It just doesn't, again, risk reward almost. Yeah. Let's have that conversation. So
that is totally spot on. And sorry to jump in, but I just wanted to jump in on that because that is exactly spot on. Not only is it an antitrust issue if you're dealing with tampering, if you're going after schools for tampering because all of a sudden you're restricting the market like you did with the transfer portal, like you did with the recruiting rules, the pre-enrollment or pre-enrollment NAL negotiation rules in Tennessee. That's a clear restriction of the market. We have an NFL case back from 1976 that says, restricting free agency is an antitrust issue if it's not covered by collective bargaining, Mackey v. NFL. But also, you're spot on. It is an employment conversation as well because employment is all control. Employment is all how much control do you have over the worker, and restricting their movement in a lot of state laws. If you look at a lot of the state laws, a lot of the federal laws that are looking at the differences between employees and independent contractors or employees and non-employees, a lot of times they are looking at factors like, are you stopping them from working other jobs? Are you stopping them from leaving? Are you stopping them from looking at other opportunities in the workforce? Because if you do have those non-compete clauses, and this is something like if you look at the Idaho test, for example, I teach in my legal environment and business class here at Boise State. One of the factors there is if there's a penalty for them leaving, if there's some kind of attached control that prevents them from easily leaving for another job, that pushes towards the employment conversation.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a labor market, right?
Yeah.
If we're having these conversations about tampering and about whether somebody is trying to, induce someone else's movement somewhere, and the money that's involved and the liquidated damages you talked about that are not really for their employment services, but that's kind of what it is. I mean, the sooner that you're able to have the conversation about this being a labor market, what employment looks like, then you can actually have some of these conversations. But again, I don't necessarily blame the NCAA for saying we'd rather deal with the tampering stuff for now and try to figure that out. So I guess back to the point of trying to, can you solve it? What are steps you can take? I guess I look to Sam for some of this. I look at the people who are employees, and the coaches are employees. The ADs are employees. And we've talked before about non-competes and how those are not really enforceable. And the FTC is going to, maybe one day actually do something about that.
Right.
But what about non-solicitation clauses and the ability for a head coach who leaves their job to then take 70% of their old roster to a new school? The coaches have a responsibility, and you could put it in their contract. You could put something. I'm curious the enforceability. I'm curious your take on practically how that works. But there is precedent. There is non-solicitation agreements in the workforce that you could potentially try to lean on that I think could be part of a conversation here to curb what you asked about before, like put your head coach hat on. What's going to keep you from doing that? Well, if I have to pay back some damages to the old school I worked at because I violated a non-solicitation agreement, that's going to make me think twice.
Yeah, and those get tricky. They do. It is definitely a viable path, potentially. It's definitely something that could potentially work. First of all, just throwing in the practicality right now, and good luck getting an agent to agree to it. I think that's kind of the first step here and kind of the first problem here, where, if you look at the leverage conversations between coaches and athletic directors, it's already very skewed towards the coaches already. And I think coaches are going to have issues. Coaches' agents are going to have issues, kind of putting that kind of clause in, though, maybe in some cases you can do it. Legally speaking, I mean, again, they're in most states, they are enforceable. It's very much a state by state conversation. Especially after the FTC tried and was overturned in Ryan, and to be able to kind of have a blanket national-wide ban on non-compete, so that doesn't necessarily affect non-solicitations. It's a bit of a different conversation, but similar legal principles if you're looking to challenge them. There also is kind of the practical issue, whereas enforcing non-solicitation clauses, it gets really tricky. Mm-hmm. It gets really challenging because you don't always know that an employee or, that someone leaving to join their supervisor at a new job is being solicited. Mm-hmm. And
much like tampering.
What's that?
Much like tampering.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You don't know if it was their choice. You don't know. And especially in these kind of conversations, especially when we're talking about the college athlete, they come to a school very often to play for a coach. It's, we can talk about the academics, we can talk about, and all that is great. All that is really important, but so much of the time they're coming to play for a specific coach, and telling that athlete, no, you can't transfer with the coach because the coach has a non-solicitation agreement. Well, they're not going to want to do that. They're going to see that as a restriction on their own movement. And it's going to be kind of the same kind of conversation. And again, it's going to be another kind of conversation where it's like, did the coach actually solicit them to leave, or are they leaving on their own volition?
Sure. And I think that, and this gets a little bit into, I think, where we're going to go with our unilateral decision and some other conversations, but I think that you can, in theory, get to a point where, yes, an athlete can absolutely make the choice to follow their coach, but I think that you have to take an action, right? And like entering the portal and leaving the school that you're at and putting yourself out there could be an option. You could get to the point where a non-solicitation agreement with a head coach or assistant coaches, however that looks. And I agree with you on the leverage piece, but like, I'm just personally kind of tired of that. Like at some point, just take a stand if you're a university, that if you think losing 60% of your football roster is that big of a liquidated damage for you, then try to do something about it. And here's a way that you possibly could,
I agree,
where you could put an agreement in with a head coach to say, if you leave for another job, you will owe us something if you violate these terms about taking all of these other athletes with you. Now, whether or not that athlete has to be an employee, an independent contractor to actually qualify under that term, different conversation. But the theory and the philosophy of saying like, no, you're going to owe us something if you end up also taking half the roster. Like, it's bad enough for you to leave. It's worse for you to take all these other athletes. But that could be wiped away if the athlete takes the step of actually like leaving the school, being in the portal. They've taken the chance where they don't know if they have a spot at the new school. The Iowa State backup linebacker doesn't know if he's got a spot at Penn State yet. He's got to take that step and get in the portal before Matt Campbell calls him. Yeah. If we can get to that point, then I think there's a little bit more leg that could be stood on with the employment side of a coach having to actually abide by something. And again, it does take the school having to step up to the plate and say, we're going to take that risk. And you know what? We're going to take the risk that maybe we can't hire the guy that we wanted number 1 on our list because he's not going to agree to those terms. But if the guy who's number 2, 3, or 4 on our list, like at some point, what's important to you?
Well, and that goes back. We were talking about the multi-year contracts for student athletes with buyouts, and people neglect to realize like recruiting is expensive, and developing talent is expensive, and there's a cost for the institution. And if you've invested all of this money, like I don't think it's a terrible thing to say, yeah, you can transfer, but if you do, like, here's what your buyout is. Here's what your next school has to pay. So you were talking about what's enforceable. And you threw out a $10 million number, but like, is there a threshold that a court would look at and say, no, that's fair?
It really does depend on the player. It really does depend. And yeah, the 10 million I threw out, it probably way too high for 99.999%
no, but you
of
could
the players.
see somebody's putting that in a contract.
Oh,
like,
for
yeah,
sure.
sure, by all means, go. But
and yeah, the reason I threw that out there is because I think that's what a lot of people want to see. Because a lot of people want to see these buyouts to be incredibly punitive, incredibly
so never
burdensome.
transferring.
So the athletes never transfer, but that's exactly what the courts are going to be looking at. They don't want to see penalty clauses where the liquidated damages clause is not a reasonable estimation of damages, but instead a penalty, instead of trying to bar you from leaving. And that's where the balance really becomes very difficult, especially when these contracts are explicitly not pay for play, especially when they're explicitly for NIL services, which is just an entirely different calculus than pay for play. Unless the court's willing to look past that and say, no, regardless of what it says in the contract, it's clearly pay for play, but we just don't know if that's actually a thing yet. So, a guy like Darian Mensa, for example, rumor has it that they eventually agreed to a settlement of $4 million for that buyout. If a court were to look at that, would the court say, okay, well, his NIL value to Duke University is $4 million? Probably not.
No.
His pay for play, his play as a quarterback is worth $4 million to Duke, for sure, at least. But would a court actually step in and say this is a reasonable approximation of damages if that number was in the contract and if that number had, kind of reached the court? We just don't know.
so there's no accepted legal threshold of like, this is new, but if somebody's contract was for $100,000 and your buyout was $25,000, like, yeah, you can transfer, but your next school is going to owe us $25,000.
And that's a lot more defensible.
Okay. So that's,
Well, and I think you could do some creative accounting to say that's what it costs to get that person on campus and what it would cost to get the next person to replace him on campus.
True.
And there's a real damage.
Damages aren't just for losing kind of the player's NIL. It's also for, what you need to do to recover from the breach of contract. So, that could be definitely part of it as well.
When we're looking at this, it all sounds like the coaches aren't going to stop. The players aren't going to stop. The agents are just going to make it worse. So we're not getting better anytime soon, right? However, you go back to a discussion we had last week with the executive order. One of the components of that was limiting to a one-time transfer. Aside from that being feasible, unlikely, whatever, let's say something like that were to come in. How much do the courts have to take action before any of this changes? And is that something that would impact massive change when you're only allowed to transfer once?
I think we've all seen it. Restricting transfers, I think those are two very different conversations. I think that trying to legislate tampering and restricting athlete movement are two very different conversations. And while I think it's natural to look at it and say, well, we could absolutely curb tampering by reducing the number of times an athlete can transfer, I feel like that's the equivalent of trying to treat a symptom instead of treating a disease. Like, yeah, sure, we can keep the arsonist from burning down a building by making buildings safer and less flammable, or we could try to just not let somebody be an arsonist. And I think that trying to curb the amount of you look at that scenario and obviously it's foolish and silly, but it's like you're putting the burden on the building owner in that case to go spend more money to retrofit their building and put in extra sprinklers and do all these things, that it's like, or we could just penalize the person who's causing all this extra work and all this extra stuff, where in this situation, the athlete, you can't restrict the athlete because you think somebody else is doing something nefarious. Like, it just doesn't work that way. So, would it help? Sure. Is it justifiable? I don't think so. And so I think that you have to have the conversations separately. Now, to your question about whether or not a court has to act in order for tampering to be curbed, I don't know. I mean, I think as we've talked through some options here, I do think they would all be tested by courts. So I think to a certain degree, yes. But I think there's some stuff you could try. I really think there's some stuff you could try with the people who are employees, the coaches, to try to, stand something up as a university and take a stance on it.
And the biggest problem is that, one of those questions answers the other one, which is that would going back to the year in residence rule, would going back to one-time transfers, only allowing for one-time transfers, would that curb tampering? Yeah, it would absolutely curb tampering because it would curb player movement. Because why would a coach tamper with a player who, has to sit out a year before they're able to play there? It would absolutely curb that market, which gets into the second part of the question, which is, is a court going to step in here? Of course, because that's exactly the legal theory behind Ohio, which ruled that the year in residence rule is an antitrust violation in the first place. I mean, it's a clear restriction of labor. It's a clear restriction of this market. It's something where, again, if you go back to the Mackey decision in '76, where we had the Rozelle rule, and we had the NFL instituting this rule saying, if you take another player's free or another team's free agent, you have to pay them compensation. And all of a sudden, teams said, "Well, I don't want to do that. I don't want to give my rival any kind of money or a player to sign this player." So free agency salaries decrease substantially. It's the same kind of thing here. If you're again penalizing, especially if you're penalizing the player by saying you have to sit out a year before you're able to play for this new team. That's exactly why the transfer portal was ruled to be an antitrust, or not the transfer portal, but the year in residence rule was ruled to be an antitrust violation in the first place.
All right. So let's cut to the chase. We're talking around this, our unilateral decision for today. If you're in charge, how do you stop tampering? Joe, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I don't know that there's an answer. So I'm going to piggyback off what Mike was talking about, finding a way to penalize, those who are actually, committing the crime, quote unquote. I don't know that financial penalties are going to do anything. Anything scholarship related, it's just going to penalize, kids who were completely uninvolved in the situation. So the only thing I can come up with is to take something away from the coaches that are involved. And I think you'd have to look at it sport by sport. Football, you get no headsets during games.
I love it.
Basketball, you get no stat sheets at timeouts.
Take that iPad away.
Yeah, no iPads. I'd love to see a coaching staff running around on the field, talking to each other face to face, trying to get a play into a student athlete who can then call it into the quarterback. And everybody, what's going on? Tampering. And that show cause, that'll follow you to your next school. I can't tell you how many times we'd sit courtside, and the guy's waiting at the printer to get those stat sheets. It is like, if I do not have this within 3 seconds, like my life might be over. So those are clearly important.
Yeah.
Take them away.
Creative problem solving. It's finest right there.
I just imagine, I think it'd be hilarious. It might solve everything. I don't know. And I don't know how that's going to get challenged in court.
That's a good question.
So that's all I got. I can't solve this one. Collective bargaining.
I think you did. I think
you might have solved it.
Headsets. I love that.
Sam, what's your take? How does one stop tampering?
I don't think you can. I just don't think you can, either legally or practically, because you look at the legal side of it. Again, we're still talking about restraints on players' movement. We're still talking about all the same issues that brought down the year in residence rule. And practically it's like, well, how do you figure out when something is tampering, when something's not tampering? And it really is one of those things where, like, all these restrictions on these labor markets, can and will be challenged, because we've seen it over the past 5 years, whether these restrictions on these labor markets in Charleston can and will be challenged, whether it's from an attorney general, or we've even seen some instances of show-cause orders getting challenged. The Jeremy Pruitt litigation right now, currently going on in Alabama. Todd McNair at USC, going back to the Reggie Bush age, was able to, even before all this, was able to successfully challenge it. It's one of those things where, just trying to pin down and going back to the conversation that Mike and I had before about, like, does having tampering restrictions, does having kind of creating more control on these athletes, through not allowing them to talk to coaches, does that create more of an employment conversation? Absolutely, though. It's also very possible that we've already long since crossed that threshold, and it doesn't even really matter anymore, because we're just waiting on the Eastern District of Pennsylvania and Johnson to say that they're employees definitively. But as far as tampering goes, as far as the kind of the practical reality of it goes and legal reality of it goes, I just don't know what the path would be to actually curb it.
I have a thought, and we'll see. But transparency for me. I think nefarious activity thrives in the shadows, and sunshine usually kills it. And without the athletes being, without them having to face consequences that are not fair to them, I think there's a way. I think you can thread the needle. We've talked about non-solicitation, but I think that if more of the activity was public and in the open, information is currency. And the more people that have that information, the less valuable the currency is. And it's very similar to the conversations we've all had. I can remember having these conversations in the department a few years ago about injury reports. And the fact of the matter was, they had to be public, because the value of the information that was in the shadows was way too high at that time. And I know, having the conversations with medical professionals and athletic trainers and all the others about HIPAA and everything else, and I get it. But at the end of the day, it is more beneficial to everybody involved for that information to be public, because of the proliferation of sports betting and all the other stuff where that information is really valuable. And if it's not public, then someone can gain an advantage by having the information. And I think we've seen that curbed. I think we've seen people move toward the injury reports. And I think that is a huge reason why. And I think from a tampering standpoint, I see it in the NFL, and I know it's different. But in the NFL, everybody knows which coach is interviewing where. All that information has to be requested and required and approved. And I'm not asking that the athletes all have to do that, but at the very least, there could be a way that the communication logs between coaches and athletes, and you could anonymize the athletes, you could anonymize the information about money and all of those things. But at the very least, I got to think there's a way that, with all the information that exists, we've seen the compliance logs. I mean, what happens, because you got to make sure that they're not talking to somebody before June 1st of their junior year in this sport, or whatever any of those rules are anymore that seem to change all the time. But I think there's a way, because we see all the time that you mentioned it at the very outset of this conversation, no one's doing it themselves, but everybody else is doing it, right? That's the public discourse. The coaches are going to claim everybody else is doing it, but we do everything right. And I think part of the problem is that you've put the onus on people to prove who's doing it wrong. And I think you can flip it, and you can put the onus on people to prove that they're doing it right, whatever the right way is. And if you make that information public, that, these logs, they're private up until 48 hours after an athlete commits, or, and you wouldn't want to tie it to the athlete, so that's not the right thing. But, like, maybe there's a time period. You've put time periods on the transfer portal. Maybe you can put time periods on the communication logs to where they're private. You're not running the risk of anybody kind of knowing the information going on. But then once it's all said and done, it is public. And if you think somebody tampered with your athlete, that information's, out there to a certain degree that somebody can have access to be like, you know what? They didn't talk to him at all after the portal opened. You're right. Or, they did talk to them before the portal opened, or whatever. I don't have all the answers, but I know that sunshine kills nefarious activity. And I think because the coaches are contracted employees, as we've talked about before, and you see examples in other sports, I think there's got to be a way that you can bring some more of that to light, to where you can have this opportunity to prove who's doing it the right way, as all these coaches want to say. And then you can move into a method where it's more of like, that guy didn't prove he did it the right way. So what does that look like? Let's call that to the carpet. And, maybe that could solve something.
Well, if it doesn't happen, with the NCAA, it may, we may start to see it more and more in legal discovery, because, maybe the solution to all this is not the NCAA doing things, because the NCAA at a league-wide level is limited, but maybe we're going to see more Wisconsins and Miamis. I don't know.
I love it. We got a lot solved today. We've got the option of transparency. We've got legal experts saying if you're not cheating, you're not trying. And we got Joe taking away headsets at football games, which would be chaos. And I would love to watch it. So a lot of great options on the table. That does it for this episode of Unilateral Decisions. We will see you next time.